In this movie, we'll look at some further aspects of lifelines and messages in sequence diagrams. We'll show how you can document the behavior of an interaction in a sequence diagram in relation to time using timing and duration constraints. There's a kind of UML interaction diagram called a timing diagram, which we don't cover in this introductory course. If you need to model serious timing issues, you should consider finding out more about timing diagrams. But for general purposes, you can add timing and duration information and constraints to sequence diagrams. Observations record information, either noting a point in time or recording the duration of a message being sent. Constraints are either absolute constraints, such as stating that something must take place within a certain duration, or are relative to the observations, for example, stating that something must take place within a certain number of milliseconds from a timing observation. Where these are associated with a message, the message is shown in the diagram slanting downwards to indicate that there is an observable duration between the sending and receiving of the message. You can see how that message is slanting down here because of the duration constraint that's been added. This diagram shows a timing observation, t equals now, on the device manager lifeline, and a timing constraint on the physical device lifeline to show that the time at that point must be no later than t plus 1 second. If we zoom into these, you can see the notation. Firstly, of the observation, t equals now. Secondly, of the constraint, in braces, t plus 1 second. This diagram shows an absolute duration constraint on the message between driver and physical device, and a duration observation on the same message. Let's zoom in so you can see. The constraint in braces says that this message must take no more than 0.5 of a second between the sending and receiving. The observation notes this duration and records it as D. The duration constraint, alongside the lifeline for device manager, says that the total time between the two messages where the arrowheads are on that line must not be greater than D times 2. Let's see how this would look in practice. Here we are in Enterprise Architect in the Add a Device sequence diagram. Let's add a duration constraint to the existing diagram. I want to show a constraint that between the actor invoking the use case and the GUI being ready, the duration must be no more than 2 seconds. To do that, I can select the reply message that comes back to the actor. There's a small arrow here next to the end of the message. When I hover over it with the mouse, you can see that it says drag to create general ordering or duration constraint. I want a duration constraint. So I drag from the arrow to the point where a message enters the lifeline that the arrow is next to. In this case, it's the controller lifeline, and the message I want the constraint to link to is the Add Device Controller constructor message at the top. So I drag to where that enters the rectangle at the top. It prompts me to enter the duration constraint, so I type in 0.2s to reflect the fact that it must take between 0 and 2 seconds. I've moved the constraint arrow away from the box at the head of the lifeline so that it's clearer. You'll see that the constraint is shown in braces. Now, in the last movie, we added a device in memory, a lifeline for on-off device. I want to test that the physical device exists, so I'm going to get the controller to send a message to Device Manager called test device with the parameter address. We'll say that the address argument is B7, which is an X10 type of code. I want this to go from the controller lifeline to the device manager lifeline before the point where I set the state to off. This is going to be an asynchronous message, and we'll add an operation to device manager called test device. And it'll take a single parameter called address, which for now I'll say is a string. And the argument is going to be B7. You can see that this is an asynchronous message with the open-headed arrow at the end of the message. Now the device manager needs to send a signal to the physical device. For simplicity, I'll just add a lifeline called physical device. Now I can send a signal from device manager to the physical device, which will be an X10 message, and I'll set this to be a signal. Using the quick linker, I drag from the lifeline of device manager to the lifeline of physical device. You may have noticed that when the diagram is scrolled down so that you can't see the heads of all the lifelines, the names of those lifelines appear in the bar at the top of the diagram pane. So I'm to change this to be a signal, so I make it asynchronous and then set it to be a signal rather than a call. I'll call it X10 message. Now, I want to show a duration constraint on this signal. I right-click on the message and select Timing Details. Here is where you enter the various observations and constraints. I'm going to add a duration observation and a duration constraint. So I type in d equals duration for the duration observation and 0.3s for the duration constraint. You'll see that the arrow is now slanting down in the diagram. Slightly change the layout of the label. That same dialog would allow us to set timing observations and constraints. So in this movie, we've added an additional lifeline and messages, including an asynchronous message and a signal. And we've added duration constraints to the diagram.